Most people assume the Vikings simply faded out, that at some point in the 11th century, these fearsome Norse warriors put down their axes, accepted Christianity, and quietly became farmers. That version of the story is almost entirely wrong. The real answer to what happened to the Vikings is far more interesting, and it splits into two completely different endings depending on which Vikings you're asking about. One group transformed themselves into the ancestors of half of modern Europe. The other vanished so completely that we still don't know exactly what happened to them. And the most recent archaeological research suggests their disappearance involved a collapsing luxury goods market, a volcanic eruption in Indonesia, and a trade route that connected the Arctic to the courts of medieval Europe. To understand where the Vikings went, you first need to understand what the word Viking actually meant, because it wasn't what most people think. Viking wasn't an ethnic identity or a nationality. It was closer to a job description. The people we call Vikings were Scandinavians, Danes, Norwegians, and Swedes. But not all Scandinavians were Vikings. The term referred specifically to those who went raiding and trading abroad, typically in the summer months. Most people in Scandinavia stayed home and farmed. The ones who left were the Vikings, and they left for a specific reason: opportunity. At the start of the Viking Age, around 793 AD, Europe was a fragmented, disorganized collection of weak kingdoms with barely any coastal defenses. A well-organized longship crew could land, take whatever they could carry, and be back at sea before anyone organized a serious response. It was brutally efficient, and it worked for nearly 300 years. Then Europe changed. Kingdoms consolidated. Rulers became more powerful. Institutions became more organized, and coastal settlements were no longer soft targets. Warfare was changing, with the shield wall gradually becoming far less important than mounted knights and archers. The kind of defense that a Viking raid simply couldn't overcome the way it once had. Raiding stopped being profitable. And when raiding stopped being profitable, the economic reason for the Viking lifestyle evaporated almost entirely. But the Scandinavian people didn't disappear. Trade, settlement, and political centralization began replacing the old raiding economy. The Vikings didn't disappear. They assimilated into many of the countries, cultures, and civilizations that they had raided, traded, and settled in. The Normans, the people who conquered England in 1066 under William the Conqueror, were the descendants of Vikings who had settled in northern France 2 generations earlier and adopted French culture so completely that by 1066 they were fighting in French, praying in French, and barely remembered they were Norse. The rulers of what would become Russia and Ukraine, the Rus, were originally Viking traders who had pushed east along river routes toward Byzantium and the Islamic world, and over generations became so intertwined with Slavic cultures that their Norse origins almost disappeared from memory. The kingdom of Sicily was ruled by Vikings. The Byzantine Emperor's personal bodyguard, the Varangian Guard, was made up largely of Norse warriors who had traveled all the way to Constantinople to sell their fighting skills. The raid slowed and stopped because the times changed. It was no longer profitable or desirable to raid. The Vikings weren't conquered. They simply became redundant as a specific economic and military model. And the people who had filled that role transformed into something new: kings, merchants, knights, settlers, while remaining exactly where they were, or in the new places they'd already moved to. That's the story of most Vikings. But then there's Greenland, and this is where the story gets genuinely strange and much darker. Around 982 AD, a Norwegian explorer named Eric the Red, already exiled from Iceland for killing a man, sailed west and discovered an island he strategically named Greenland, hoping the attractive name would draw settlers. It worked. Within a few years, Norse colonists had established 2 separate settlements on Greenland's southwestern coast, and for the next 4.5 centuries, they built farms, churches, and a functioning society at the very edge of the known world. At their peak, the Greenland colonies housed several thousand people. They were visited by European ships. They sent representatives to the Norwegian king. In 1408, there is a record of a wedding held in the Eastern Settlement's church. the last documented sign of normal social life in the colony. Then silence. By around 1450, archaeological and radiocarbon evidence suggests that the eastern settlement was fully abandoned. Within a generation after that 1408 wedding, an entire Norse civilization that had survived on the edge of the Arctic for almost 5 centuries was simply gone. For a long time, historians blamed the Greenland Vikings for their own extinction. The popular theory, made famous by Jared Diamond's book Collapse, argued that the Norse settlers stubbornly refused to adapt, that they kept trying to farm cattle in an environment that couldn't support it, refused to learn from their Inuit neighbors who survived the same conditions perfectly well, and essentially farmed themselves into oblivion. But more recent archaeology has largely dismantled that narrative. New excavations across the North Atlantic have forced archaeologists to revise some of these long-held views, suggesting that the Greenland Norse focused less on livestock and more on trade, especially in walrus ivory, and that for food, they relied more on the sea than on their pastures. And this is where the story connects to something almost nobody would have predicted. The fate of an entire Arctic civilization was determined, in large part, by the European luxury goods market. Ivory was their currency. Norse society in Greenland couldn't survive without trade with Europe. The Greenland colonists had figured out that what they could offer, what nobody else could supply, was walrus ivory. Every spring and summer, Norse hunters would make grueling journeys north to hunting grounds, where walruses hauled themselves out of the water in vast numbers. The tusks were harvested and shipped back to Europe, where they were carved into luxury objects, chess pieces, religious icons, decorative handles, and sold at extraordinary prices to the courts and churches of medieval Europe. In return, the Greenland colonists received iron, timber, grain, and everything else they couldn't produce in the Arctic. It was a viable economy. It worked for centuries. Then, in the 13th century, their world changed profoundly. 3 separate forces converged almost simultaneously, and any one of them alone might have been survivable. Together, they were catastrophic. First, the climate cooled because of a volcanic eruption in Indonesia. Sea ice increased, and so did ocean storms. The routes that Norse hunters used to reach the walrus grounds became more dangerous. The growing seasons that sustained their livestock shortened. The cold made everything harder. Second, and most fatally, the market for walrus ivory collapsed, partly because Portugal and other countries started to open trade routes into sub-Saharan Africa, which brought elephant ivory to the European market. Elephant ivory was larger, whiter, and easier to carve than walrus tusk. Once it was available in quantity, European buyers abandoned walrus ivory almost entirely. The Greenland colonists had built their entire survival strategy around a product that the European market simply stopped wanting. In the 14th century, ivory from Russian walruses and African elephants, which was cheaper and easier to obtain, flooded the market, causing the prices of Greenland ivory to fall, destabilizing a large part of the settler economy. Third, the Black Death tore through Europe. It never reached Greenland directly, but it killed roughly half of Norway's population, the country that Greenland depended on for trade ships and supplies. Because Greenland relied heavily on Norway for imported goods, this affected Greenland too. Ships stopped coming. The supply chain that had connected this tiny Arctic civilization to the rest of the world simply broke. Fewer personal belongings and abandoned Norse homes seems to suggest that there was an orderly departure, by at least some people, though scholars still argue over whether this was planned emigration to Iceland or Scandinavia, or gradual die-off due to sheer relentless hardship. The most haunting detail comes from the last excavated farmhouses. The doors were left standing open. Whatever happened at the end, it happened in a way that left the buildings intact, the landscape undisturbed, and almost no trace of violence. An entire civilization simply stopped being there. So here's the real answer to what happened to the Vikings. Most of them are still here. They became the English, the French Normans, the Russians, the Ukrainians, the Sicilians, absorbed so completely into the cultures they either raided or settled, that their Norse origins became a footnote. But the ones who tried hardest to stay Vikings, who pushed to the furthest edge of the known world, and built a civilization on walrus tusks and Arctic endurance. Those ones disappeared in a silence that archaeologists are still trying to understand. Their last recorded act was a wedding. Their next chapter is a mystery. What do you think finished the Greenland Vikings? Was it the climate, the ivory market, or something we still haven't found yet? Let us know in the comments. And if you want more stories about civilizations that went somewhere unexpected, subscribe to Chronicle Vault. There's a lot more in the vault.